In 1928, a young man sits alone on a train somewhere between New York and Los Angeles, staring out the window with nothing but a sketch pad on his lap and a heart full of rage. A few days earlier, everything he had spent the last 2 years building had been taken from him. The studio executives in New York had just informed him that they owned his most successful cartoon character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and that if he did not agree to their terms, they would simply hire his entire staff away from him and make the cartoons themselves. He had walked out of that meeting with nothing. Not the character, not the studio, not even most of his team. And now he was on a train, heading home, broke, humiliated, and starting over from zero. But somewhere between New York and Los Angeles, on that long, quiet train ride, this starving young artist picked up his pencil and began to draw. And what he drew on that train would go on to become the most recognizable fictional character in the history of human entertainment. This is the story of how Walter Elias Disney, a poor farmer's son who was once so broke. He ate dog food to survive, went on to build the most beloved entertainment empire the world has ever known. The story begins in 1901, in Chicago, Illinois, where Elias and Flora Disney welcomed their 4th child into the world. Walter Elias Disney, the Disney family were not wealthy by any measure. Elias Disney was a hard-working but perpetually struggling man who tried his hand at various ventures over the years, including farming construction and newspaper delivery, none of which ever provided the family with much financial security. The family moved frequently throughout Walt's childhood, chasing opportunities that never quite materialized, and as a result, Walt grew up knowing what it felt like to go without. When Walt was 4 years old, the family moved to a farm in Marceline, Missouri, and it was there on that quiet Midwestern farm that the boy who would one day create the most magical place on earth first began to develop his imagination. The farm was a world of its own, filled with animals, open fields, and the kind of unhurried rural life that leaves a deep impression on a young mind. Walt loved the animals on the farm more than anything else, and would spend hours watching them moving and playing and interacting with each other, storing away observations that would later breathe life into some of the most beloved animated characters ever created. He also began drawing during these years, sketching the animals and the landscapes around him with a natural talent that surprised everyone who saw his work. A neighbor named Doc Sherwood was so impressed with young Walt's drawings that he actually paid the boy to sketch his horse. It was the first money Walt Disney ever earned from his art, and the experience planted a seed in him that would never stop growing. But the idyllic years on the Marceline farm did not last in 1910. Financial difficulties forced the family to sell the farm and move to Kansas City, Missouri, where Elias bought a newspaper delivery route and put his sons, including the young Walt, to work delivering papers every morning in the freezing cold before school. Walt was just 9 years old, and he was already learning what it meant to work hard for very little reward. The newspaper route was exhausting and thankless, and during the brutal Midwestern winters, Walt would sometimes fall asleep on doorsteps from sheer exhaustion. It was a childhood that taught him resilience, whether he wanted to learn it or not. From a very young age, Walt showed an exceptional gift for drawing and performance. He loved making people laugh and would regularly entertain his classmates with impressions and sketches. During these years, he also became fascinated with the emerging world of film and theater, sneaking into movie theaters whenever he could scrape together enough money for a ticket. He was particularly captivated by the work of Charlie Chaplin, whose ability to make audiences feel deep emotion through physical comedy and visual storytelling left a permanent mark on the young boy's imagination. When World War I broke out, Walt was only 16 years old, but desperate to serve his country. He lied about his age and joined the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. He was sent to France, where he spent a year driving an ambulance and witnessing the aftermath of the war. It was a sobering experience for a teenager, but even in France, Walt could not stop drawing. He covered his ambulance with cartoon characters and caricatures and continued sketching in every spare moment he had. When he returned to the United States in 1919, Walt Disney was 18 years old and absolutely certain of one thing. He was going to be an artist. Walt settled in Kansas City after the war and got a job at a commercial art studio called Pesman Rubin, where he met a young Dutch illustrator named Ube Ewerks. The two became close friends, immediately bonding over their shared passion for art and animation. After being laid off from Pesman Rubin, both men decided to start their own commercial art company called Ewerks Disney Commercial Artists. The company struggled almost immediately, and within a month Walt had pivoted again, this time to animation. He had become obsessed with the possibilities of animated film after watching early cartoons and teaching himself the basics of animation. From library books with borrowed equipment and almost no money, Walt began producing a series of short animated films called Laughograms, which were fairy tale parodies that he sold to a local Kansas City theater. The films were a modest local hit, and encouraged by their reception, Walt founded his own animation studio called Laughogram Studio in 1921 at the age of just 19. For a brief and exciting period, it seemed like Laughogram Studio might be the beginning of something real. Walt hired a small team of animators, including his friend Ube Ewerks, and began producing films with genuine ambition. But the studio was chronically underfunded, and Walt was far better at creating than he was at managing money. The company's distributor went bankrupt, leaving the studio without income, and no matter how hard Walt tried to keep things afloat, the money simply ran out. In 1923, Laughogram Studio declared bankruptcy, and Walt Disney was left with virtually nothing. He was 21 years old, broke, and had just watched his first business collapse around him, but Walt Disney was not built to give up. With the ruins of Laughogram behind him, Walt made a decision that would change the course of his life. He was going to go to Hollywood and make it in the movie business. He arrived in Los Angeles in the summer of 1923 with a cardboard suitcase, $40 in his pocket, and an unfinished animated film called Alice's Wonderland. Under his arm, he moved in with his older brother Roy, who was recovering from tuberculosis at a local veterans hospital, and together the two brothers decided to go into business. The Disney Brothers studio was founded in their uncle's garage with almost no money and an enormous amount of determination. Walt spent weeks knocking on doors at every major film studio in Hollywood trying to get work as a director. None of them were interested. But while making those rounds, he had an idea he would combine live-action footage with animation. Creating a series of films that featured a real girl interacting with a cast of animated characters, he called the concept the Alice Comedies. And when a New York film distributor named Margaret Winkler agreed to purchase the series, Walt Disney's professional career was officially born over the next few years. The Alice Comedies proved popular enough to keep the studio running, and Walt and Roy slowly built their small operation into something resembling a real company. They hired animators, including their old friend Ube Ewerks, and began developing their craft and their business simultaneously. Walt also got married during this period to a young ink and paint artist named Lillian Bounds, who would remain his partner and closest confidant for the rest of his life. But the Alice Comedies eventually ran their course, and Walt needed a new character. When the opportunity came, it arrived in the form of a deal with Universal Pictures for a new cartoon series built around a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald was a cheerful, energetic rabbit whose cartoons became genuinely popular with audiences. The series was a breakthrough for the Disney studio, and for the first time, Walt felt like he was building something that could last in early 1928. Feeling confident about Oswald's success, Walt traveled to New York to negotiate better terms with his distributor, Charles Mintz. What happened in that meeting would become one of the most pivotal moments in the history of entertainment. Mintz informed Walt that rather than giving him a raise, he was going to cut his budget by 20%. And if Walt refused to accept the cut, Mintz told him he would simply take the Oswald character, which Universal owned, and hire away most of Walt's animators who had already been secretly approached and were prepared to leave. Walt was devastated. He had put everything into building Oswald into a successful character, and now he was being told that the character didn't even belong to him. He had no leverage, no legal recourse, and no options. He rejected Mintz's terms, walked out of the meeting, and lost almost everything overnight. The train ride back to Los Angeles from New York took several days, and it was during those long, quiet hours, staring out at the passing American landscape, that Walt Disney did what he always did. When the world knocked him down, he drew the character that emerged from those sketches. On that train was a small round mouse with big ears, a cheerful disposition, and an irrepressible sense of mischief. Walt called him Mortimer, but his wife Lillian thought the name was too pompous and suggested Mickey instead. And just like that, Mickey Mouse was born back in Los Angeles. Walt threw himself into developing the new character with a sense of urgency and purpose that surprised even the people closest to him. He produced 2 Mickey Mouse cartoons in quick succession, but when he took them to distributors, nobody was interested. The market was changing rapidly, and by 1928, sound was transforming the film industry, following the massive success of The Jazz Singer. The first feature film with synchronized dialogue, and Walt realized immediately that the future of animation was in sound. He scrapped the first 2 silent Mickey Mouse cartoons and began working on a third one called Steamboat Willie. This time with fully synchronized sound. It was a technically ambitious and financially risky undertaking for a small studio with very little money, but Walt refused to compromise. He recorded the soundtrack himself, standing in front of a microphone in a New York recording studio, making all the sound effects personally, and conducting the small orchestra. With a click track he had invented himself. Steamboat Willie premiered on November 18, 1928 at the Colony Theater in New York City, and the audience's reaction was immediate and electric. They had never seen or heard anything like it. The combination of character animation and perfectly synchronized sound created a completely new kind of entertainment experience, and Mickey Mouse was an instant sensation. Within weeks, Mickey Mouse was the most talked about cartoon character in America, and the Disney studio was flooded with licensing requests and distribution offers. The little mouse that Walt had sketched on a train ride home from the worst meeting of his life had just changed the entertainment world forever. The success of Steamboat Willie gave the Disney studio the financial foundation it needed to grow. And Walt, being Walt, immediately began pushing the boundaries of what animation could do. He launched the Silly Symphonies series, which used music as the foundation for animated storytelling, and produced Flowers and Trees. The first ever cartoon made in full 3-strip Technicolor, which won the very first Academy Award ever given to an animated film. But as always with Walt Disney, the small victories only made him hungry for something larger. Something that everyone around him told him was completely impossible. In 1934, Walt announced to his team that the studio was going to make a feature-length animated film. A full-length movie told. Entirely through animation, the announcement was met with widespread disbelief. Within the industry, Hollywood insiders and journalists immediately dubbed the project Disney's Folly. Convinced that no audience would sit through an hour and a half of cartoons and that the financial cost would destroy the studio. the budget spiraled out of control, going from an initial estimate of around $250,000 to a final cost of approximately $1.7 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for an animated film in 1937. To finish the film, Walt had to mortgage his own house and borrow money from every source available to him. When Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs finally premiered on December 21, 1937. At the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles, the industry prepared to watch Walt Disney fail publicly and spectacularly. Instead, the audience gave it a standing ovation. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs became the highest-grossing film of 1938, earning nearly $8 million worldwide. It was a cultural phenomenon that proved animation could be a serious and emotionally powerful art form, and it established the Disney Studio as one of the most important creative institutions in the entertainment industry. Virtually overnight, the years that followed were a golden period for Disney, with a string of beloved films, including Pinocchio Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi. Each one pushing the boundaries of what animation could achieve, and each one cementing the studio's reputation for uncompromising quality and emotional depth. But Walt was already thinking about something far beyond movies. Throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s, Walt Disney had been nurturing a dream that made even his closest colleagues nervous. He wanted to build a physical place where families could come together and experience the worlds and characters from his films. In real life, he imagined a clean, beautiful, meticulously designed park where every detail would be controlled and where visitors would be transported completely out of their ordinary lives. Everyone around him thought he had lost his mind. The entertainment industry had no framework for understanding what he was describing. Banks refused to lend him money. His own brother Roy thought the idea was financially reckless. The television networks he approached for funding were skeptical, and even the site he eventually chose in Anaheim, California, was dismissed by critics as a swamp. But Walt had learned long ago that the people who told him something was impossible were usually just describing their own limitations. He raised the money by creating a television show called Disneyland for ABC, which gave the network programming in exchange for an investment in the park. He sold the rights to his own name and the rights to future films. He leveraged everything he had. And on July 17, 1955, Disneyland opened its gates to the public. For the first time, the opening day was a disaster, plagued by traffic jams, counterfeit tickets, overflowing crowds, and a heat wave that caused women's high heels to sink into the freshly laid asphalt. But Walt Disney refused to see it as a failure. He adjusted, improved, and relentlessly refined the park in the weeks and months that followed, and within its first year, Disneyland had welcomed over 3.5 million visitors today. Disneyland and its sister parks around the world welcome over 83 million visitors every year, making the Disney theme park division one of the most profitable entertainment operations on the planet. Walt Disney died on December 15, 1966, from lung cancer at the age of 65. He did not live to see Walt Disney World open in Florida, a project he had spent the last years of his life designing and planning. But the company he built and the characters he created have only grown larger and more beloved in the decades since his death today. The Walt Disney Company is one of the largest entertainment conglomerates in the world, with a market value of over $200 billion. It owns Marvel Studios, Pixar, Lucasfilm, ESPN, ABC, and hundreds of other brands and properties, and at the center of all of it still stands the small round mouse with the big ears that a starving, broke, and humiliated young artist drew on a train ride home from the worst day of his life, from eating dog food in a Kansas City apartment to building the most magical empire in entertainment history. Walt Disney proved that the most extraordinary things in the world are usually created by the people who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to subscribe and like the video until then. I'll see you in the next one.